Hi and welcome. I think the way the current fascist threat will be beaten back is most likely through 1,000 small cuts, each seemingly undramatic. After all, over the past several decades, Trump's brand of fascism has gained as much power as it has by 1,000 cuts. What I plan to offer now is an overview. Because there's been a steady drip of evidence of Trump and Republican crimes, there's been an expectation among some that criminal prosecution will bring Trump and his brand of American fascism crashing down. A few weeks ago, in a video called Republican Lawbreaking, I explained why I think criminal prosecution is unlikely to end the danger posed by what we might call the Trump Newsmax Fox Republican Party. I used to call it the Trump Fox Party, but the sad fact is that right-wing media has now moved far to the right of Fox News. If you missed that video and your expectation is that criminal prosecution will or can put an end to American fascism, you might want to watch that one first, or you can read the transcript on my blog. We have a political problem, and political problems require political solutions. What prosecution can do is help expose the truth. Fascism is built on lies. Rule of law, which requires a shared factuality, is based on truth. That's why truth is the enemy of fascism. Let's look at some of these small cuts. Well, the DOJ refused to defend Mo Brooks in his lawsuit about inciting the insurrection, which means it's almost certain they'll also refuse to defend Trump. If you don't think that's significant, consider what a DOJ under one of Trump's appointees would be doing right now. Another, Trump is being criminally investigated for that phone call to Georgia, the Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger, in which he told Raffensperger to find the votes that would make Trump the winner in Georgia. Congress is looking into Trump's phone call with senior Justice Department officials in which Trump pressured officials to say that the election was rigged as part of his larger scheme to undermine the 2020 election. These new revelations about the efforts of Trump government insiders to overturn the results of the 2020 election mean that the choice for voters in upcoming elections will be stark. Vote Republican and vote for a party that will actively undermine free and fair elections. Republican leaders were afraid these investigations would spill into 2022 and affect the midterms. Now it's fairly certain that they will. And don't forget, the Trump Organization has been indicted, and that investigation is ongoing. I strongly suspect more indictments are coming. Also in New York, Attorney General Letitia James has joined Vance's criminal probe. In 2019, she opened a separate civil investigation into Trump's business practices. When the public is bombarded with evidence that Trump got rich by cheating, it gets harder for him to claim he's a successful businessman because he's a good businessman. And it narrows his appeal to those who think it's perfectly fine to get rich cheating. And there's the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. There's really no doubt that Trump incited that insurrection. Even McConnell said Trump was practically and morally responsible for the Capitol riot. That evidence will be dripping out over the next year or two. At the same time, there are signs that Trumpism isn't going away and that Trump is not losing his grip on the Republican Party. Trump raised a stunning $100 million since losing office. While Trump's pick in the Texas primary, Susan Wright, lost, his choice in Ohio, Mike Carey, won. Elected officials like Elise Stefanik obviously think it's better for their political future to grovel at Trump's feet. And of course, Republicans in numerous states are taking steps to make it easier to keep people from voting and make it easier for them not to count votes from Democratic areas. But without going too much into that right now, this can be stopped with legislation from Congress and only works in close elections because the courts, even Trump-appointed judges, have proven that they're not going along with these lies. In fact, one of the institutions that saved us from Trump's attempted coup was the courts. In fact, I wrote about that in this Washington Post piece. Lifetime tenure meant that even Trump's Supreme Court picks could resist his pressure. While Republicans everywhere folded to Trump's fantasies, it took an independent judiciary to shut him down. This brings me to Trump's lawyers being sanctioned and possibly disbarred by the courts, which is among the thousands of cuts. A federal judge in Colorado sanctioned 2 lawyers who brought a conspiracy-filled lawsuit trying to overturn the 2020 election. The judge found the case was frivolous and not warranted by existing law and filed in bad faith. Similarly, in Michigan, Sidney Powell and Lynn Wood are facing sanctions for bringing election fraud lawsuits that had no basis in law or fact. In June, a New York appellate court suspended Rudy Giuliani's license to practice law. I wrote about that when it happened in this NBC Think piece entitled "Rudy Giuliani's New York Suspension Proves Dangers of Trump Lies." The court in that case said this: "The seriousness of respondents, Giuliani's uncontroverted misconduct, cannot be overstated. This country is being torn apart by continued attacks on the legitimacy of the 2020 election and of our current president, Joseph R. Biden. The hallmark of our democracy is predicated on free and fair elections. False statements intended to foment a loss of confidence in our elections and resulting loss of confidence in government generally damage the proper functioning of a free society. When those false statements are made by an attorney, it also erodes the public's confidence in the integrity of attorneys admitted to the bar and damages the profession's role as a crucial source of reliable information. Disbarment, a punishment meted out by a court for code violations, occurs when a lawyer commits an offense that directly relates to his or her fitness to practice law. This is serious and always devastating to a lawyer. Given the harsh words the court had to say, and the way that it made mincemeat of Giuliani's silly defenses, it means that unless Giuliani comes up with better defenses than those he's already presented, and it's unlikely he can, he will never again practice law in New York. You may be thinking, so what? Well, for one thing, these rulings serve as a warning to other lawyers who may try to use the courts as a vehicle for spreading lies. Also, we do have the courts denouncing these lies. If you don't think that's a big deal, imagine how you'd feel if courts were backing up the lie, which is what happens in autocracies. As I mentioned earlier, courts are one of the institutions that saved us from Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election. Let's talk about one battle Trump will certainly lose: his fight to keep his taxes out of the hands of Congress. I wrote about that this past week in this Washington Post piece, 4 Flaws in Trump's Fight to Hang On to His Tax Returns. So here's what's going on. Last week, the Department of Justice ordered the Internal Revenue Service to hand over Trump's tax returns to Congress. On Monday, Ronald Fischetti, a lawyer for Trump, said that Trump intends to fight the order. He also made this statement to the press: "There is no evidence of any wrongdoing here, and I object to the release of the returns, not only on behalf of my client, but also on behalf of all future holders of the office of the President of the United States." He added that this politicization and harassment of Mr. Trump is uncalled for and outrageous, and that he had never seen anything like this. Well, there are four gaping holes with this statement. First, there is considerable evidence of wrongdoing. To begin with, the Trump Organization was indicted for tax fraud and falsification of records in what prosecutors described as a 15-year tax avoidance scheme constituting a systematic, ongoing course of conduct with intent to defraud. Trump's former longtime personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, testified before Congress about crimes he said he had committed at Trump's behest. Those crimes included misusing charity funds and bank and insurance fraud. Cohen testified that Trump inflated or deflated the value of properties depending upon his needs at any given moment. Cohen presented copies of Trump's bank and financial records to back up his claims. On September 27, 2020, the New York Times published information it had obtained from Trump's tax records extending over more than 2 decades. The records showed, despite Trump's repeated claims that he was a successful businessman and a billionaire, he paid no income tax at all in 10 of the 15 years preceding his presidency. These records revealed struggling properties, outsized tax write-offs, and a taxpayer in serious trouble with hundreds of millions of dollars in debt coming due. Fischetti's statement that there is no evidence of wrongdoing is an insult to all of us who have been bombarded by such evidence for years. Second, another gaping hole in his statement: Congress had a legitimate legislative purpose for requesting the tax returns. The House Ways and Means Committee sought Trump's returns to determine whether the IRS was fully and appropriately auditing the president. At issue is the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. The Trump administration was consistent in its claim that the president was absolutely immune from legislative oversight. He even said, I have the Article 2 of the Constitution where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. A dangerous doctrine designed to create an autocrat. In her book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, New York University professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat defines authoritarianism as a political system in which executive power is asserted at the expense of the legislative and judicial branches of government, if for no other reason than to limit the power of the executive branch. These records should be furnished to Congress. The third problem in Fichetti's defense is the idea that Trump is objecting on behalf of all future presidents. Rule of law literally means that the law applies to the president as much as it does anyone. Anything else is autocracy. The fourth hole is fairly obvious. How is making Trump's tax returns available to Congress harassment unless Trump has much to hide? He was, after all, the first president to refuse to disclose his taxes. Richard Nixon voluntarily released his returns when media reports suggested that he paid only $792 in federal income tax in 1970 and only $878 in 1971, even though he earned more than $200,000 in each of those years. To allay public concerns, Nixon subsequently released his tax returns for every year between 1969, when he entered office, and 1972. Every president since Nixon voluntarily released his tax returns. On Thursday, Trump lawyers filed their motion in court. Interestingly, it was quite professional and didn't include any of the outlandish lies that his lawyer had said to the press. His lawyers were perfectly willing to lie to the press, but if they don't lie to the court, they're less likely to get into trouble with bar associations. I suggest that those lawyers took more care because of all the sanctioning going on of Trump's other lawyers. In other words, those sanctions and possible disbarments are serving as a deterrent. The argument his lawyers presented in court, in a nutshell, was that super special Trump shouldn't have to comply because big bad Congress is being really, really mean to him. I don't expect that argument to fly. Basically, it was silly, and if the courts take it seriously, it's dangerous, but it wasn't sanctionable. So while Trump still controls the Republican Party, and he managed to raise $100 million since the election, what looms larger is that he has hundreds of millions of dollars coming due, plus a growing pile of legal bills, and a shortage of lawyers willing to work for him. Plus, his businesses are on shaky footing right now. After I tweeted my theory that if American fascism is to be defeated, it will be through a series of small cuts, I was hit with cynicism from left-leaning Twitter. Here's a sampling. It's about time. Sure, if it ever happens. Too little, too late. Though for Trump, the taxes prosecution is only a flesh wound. Here's one. If I may be so bold, what on earth is Georgia waiting for? Lordy, there are tapes. Investigations take time. The tapes are not by themselves evidence beyond a reasonable doubt because proving intent is tricky. Due process is a lengthy process. In an autocracy, you can have instant justice. The autocrat says, the tapes prove it, he's guilty, and that's the end of it. But that's not how it works in a rule of law democracy. Here's another. Put him in prison and restore America. Again, as if that's a magic bullet. It isn't. See my video on Republican lawbreaking. And this one. It's not nearly enough. We have a history of rich white men behaving and mostly getting away with it or getting slapped on the wrist. Remember, we're in a transition. Since 1954, the United States has been mostly trying to transition from a representative democracy dominated by white men with institutions that entirely served white men to a true racially diverse democracy, and we've been facing fierce backlash. Given that we're in a transition, looking to our history as an excuse to feel pessimistic about a possible future undercuts our ability to make the transition. There's a reason the great liberal leaders and trailblazers of the past, the ones who made a real difference, didn't spread doomsday gloom. They inspired people with possibilities. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. I'll add that cynicism is a hallmark of fascism. People who embrace fascism often don't believe equality is possible. They don't believe fairness is possible. If you don't believe fairness and equality are possible, politics becomes about who can win by any means necessary. So don't be cynical. We will only make this transition if enough people feel empowered by possibilities instead of paralyzed by cynicism. Well, I said a lot of that on Twitter, and I got more pushback. Yes, says this person, but the idea that a con man, criminal, can get himself elected as president and that he's untouchable for his entire time in office is so wrong that we need new words to describe that sort of corruption. No doubt Bannon and Barr played the game, but we can't let it stand. Well, the problem was that Trump was shielded by a major political party, including the Senate. The failure was in the Republican Party. They chose to shield a law-breaking president. Institutions can't be any better than the people who form them. After I posted that, the same person responded saying, of course, no one figured that the entire administration and one of two political parties would all be corrupt. But if I understood it correctly, the president is still basically above the law while he's president. That seems fundamentally un-American to me. The Constitution provides a remedy for a law-breaking president. The House impeaches, the Senate convicts and removes. After the president is removed, the Constitution specifically says that the president can then be tried in a criminal court. Things went wrong during the Trump presidency at the Senate trial stage. The Constitution also provides a remedy for senators who don't do their jobs and refuse to convict when they should. Vote them out. The buck stops with the voters.